She looked him dead in the eyes and said, "If you hadn't come today," she would have called someone else Daddy. On a fog-draped morning in the quiet town of Ashbourne, Grace Holloway stood behind the counter of a small corner bakery, tying her apron with the practiced ease of someone who had long since learned to survive on little more than hope and habit. Her daughter Lily, barely 8, sat at the end booth swinging her legs under the table and sketching animals in a worn notebook as the scent of warm cinnamon rolls filled the room. They were always the first to arrive, Grace, to prep the ovens, Lily, because there was nowhere else to go. Across the street, a black sedan pulled into an empty space, and a tall man in a charcoal coat stepped out, looking far too polished for a town like this. He paused in front of the bakery window, his eyes catching on the child's drawing, then quickly looked away. Inside, Grace didn't see him, but Lily did. She tilted her head, curious. The man entered moments later, ordered coffee with a voice low and unfamiliar, and sat alone by the window. What neither of them knew was that this morning would begin the unraveling of a silence that had lasted nearly 9 years. The town of Ashbourne woke slowly, like a tired breath drawn beneath flannel skies. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and most days began with the soft clatter of a bell above the bakery door. Grace Holloway arrived at 5:30 sharp, as she had every morning for the past 6 years, shoulders squared against the Kentucky chill key in hand, face unreadable. The bakery wasn't hers. She just kept it alive, baking before dawn, cleaning after dusk, and making sure the regulars had their usuals ready before they even spoke. This morning, like most, her daughter Lily trailed behind her in an oversized hoodie, her tiny hand wrapped tightly around a sketchbook already smudged with pencil dust. The air inside the bakery was cold and quiet, but familiar. Grace flicked on the lights, set the ovens, and began rolling dough with silent precision. Outside, the town stirred trucks, warming shutters, lifting the postman walking his slow route. Inside, Lily sat at the corner booth, her legs swinging eyes on a squirrel she was trying to draw. At 6:04, the bell above the door chimed. A man stepped in. He wore a pressed coat, dark as coal, and shoes that had never touched gravel. His eyes were the kind that looked like they'd seen too much and still couldn't explain it. He didn't say much, just ordered coffee black and sat facing the window watching fog roll off the hills. Grace barely looked up. Men like him didn't stay. She'd seen their type before, passing through haunted by something they never named. But Lily noticed him. She always noticed everything. After a few quiet minutes, she stood up, walked over, and placed half her sandwich on his table without a word. "You look hungry," she said simply. The man blinked, startled, then smiled just barely. "Thank you," he whispered. And with that, the silence in his chest cracked ever so slightly. Grace Holloway moved like a woman who had no time for wasted motion. Every task, whether flipping the sign to open folding napkins or wiping down the counter, was done with quiet efficiency, the kind you earn not from training, but from surviving. Her apron was worn at the edges, flour permanently embedded in its seams, and her hands bore the memory of every dish every morning, every late bill paid with tips, counted by dim kitchen light. She didn't complain. She didn't have the luxury. Lily, her daughter, was curled up in the booth nearest the counter, her sketchbook open, her small fingers smudged with graphite. She should have been at school, but a fever earlier in the week, and the lack of anyone to watch her meant Grace had brought her along. Again, no one said anything. This was Ashbourne's small-town kindness, often meant small-town silence. Grace glanced at Lily between orders, always with a flicker of guilt she never voiced. She wanted more for her daughter, more than early morning's leftover biscuits and being the child who knew how to refill the creamers at age 6. But wanting didn't change much when rent was due and the car needed brakes. Outside, dawn was crawling across the sky, slow and uncertain. Inside, the coffee was brewing, and the smell of cinnamon rolls filled the room. Lily hummed softly as she drew a bear in a scarf today, or maybe a wolf with wings. Grace didn't ask. She just brought her a warm scone and brushed her hand gently across Lily's hair before turning back to the register. In that moment, nothing seemed extraordinary, just a mother doing what she could, and a child who had learned to be quiet in the hours where other children were still sleeping. But behind Lily's eyes was something bright, and behind Grace's silence was a history she never spoke aloud. Not yet. At exactly 6:04 a.m., the bell above the bakery door let out a single deliberate chime that sliced through the quiet like a clock striking a forgotten hour. Grace didn't look up right away. She was pulling a tray of golden biscuits from the oven, steam clouding her glasses, focus fixed on not burning the bottoms. But Lily looked. She always looked. The man who entered wasn't from Ashbourne. That much was obvious. He wore a dark wool coat, too fine for this town, his shoes polished and free of gravel dust, his posture upright in a way that suggested boarding schools and pressure. His hair was neatly combed but slightly damp from the mist, and his eyes carried the color of steel, cool, distant, yet somehow bruised. Ethan Whitaker stepped inside like someone who had once belonged everywhere and now belonged nowhere. He hesitated, taking in the bakery like a man examining a memory he wasn't sure was real. His gaze landed on the chalkboard menu, but he didn't scan it. He already knew. Just coffee. He said, his voice low, clear, and exhausted. Black. Grace finally looked up. Just a glance. Just enough to register the shape of his jaw, the slope of his shoulders, the kind of weary wealth that lingers even when it's trying not to be noticed. Something flickered in her chest, but she buried it beneath a nod and turned to pour his drink. Ethan sat by the window, fingers curling slowly around the warm paper cup, eyes tracing the condensation on the glass, as if he were watching something vanish. He didn't speak again, didn't take out a phone, didn't glance at a watch. He simply sat there still as Stone, drinking coffee that wasn't particularly good, but tasted for some reason like something he needed. Across the room, Lily tilted her head as she watched him, one small hand still smudged with pencil. There was something about him, something that didn't fit, like a chapter torn from another book and laid inside their quiet morning. Neither Grace nor Ethan spoke again that hour, but the air between them had shifted slightly, like a curtain catching wind before the storm. Lily watched him for a long while before moving. She wasn't the kind of child who approached strangers. Grace had taught her better than that. But something about the man by the window didn't feel strange. He looked like someone trying very hard not to cry the way adults sometimes did when they thought no one was watching. His cup of coffee had gone cold, untouched for nearly 20 minutes. He hadn't looked up once. Lily glanced at her mother, who was in the back refilling the pastry case, then at the sandwich sitting half-eaten on her plate. Grace had barely touched it, too busy, too tired. Carefully, Lily folded the wax paper over the remaining half, slid off her seat, and walked across the room with the kind of quiet determination only small children have when they believe they're about to fix something big. She stopped in front of the man's table, held out the sandwich in both hands, and said in her small, even voice, "You can have this. My mom says people who look sad should eat breakfast." Ethan looked up, startled, and met the eyes of a girl who couldn't have been more than 8, standing in socked feet inside pink rubber boots, her face tilted with unfiltered concern. For a moment he didn't speak. Then he blinked once slowly, like waking from something far away. He looked down at the sandwich, then back at her. "Is that so?" he asked, voice rougher than before. Lily nodded, especially on cold mornings. "Cinnamon bread is best, but this one's still warm." She placed the sandwich on the table gently, like it was something important, and stepped back. Ethan stared at it, then at her retreating figure, then down again, suddenly unsure how long it had been since someone had handed him anything without wanting something in return. He picked it up. It was simple, just egg and cheese between thick slices of bread, but it was warm, and it was real. And for the first time in weeks, Ethan Whitaker took a bite and felt something settle in his chest that almost felt like home. Ethan Whitaker hadn't expected to feel anything that morning. He'd come to Ashburn to disappear, to dissolve into the silence of a town that didn't know his name, to drink bad coffee in peace, and maybe, if he was lucky, remember less. But the moment the little girl placed the sandwich in front of him, looked him in the eye with that unflinching, open-hearted sincerity, something inside him stuttered. He blinked once, twice, then stared after her as she padded back to her booth, her small body swallowed in a hoodie, several sizes too large, curls bouncing as she moved. He hadn't breathed in that second because, for a moment, a long, disorienting moment, he could have sworn he was looking at someone else. Her face. It wasn't identical, but the tilt of her chin, the quiet steadiness of her gaze, the way her mouth curved into thought instead of speech. It all clawed at a memory he'd spent nearly a decade trying to bury. Grace. The name hit him like a whisper wrapped in thunder. Grace Holloway. The woman he once loved and left. The woman who had looked at him one night in a narrow dorm room with eyes just like that, quiet, certain, forgiving before the hurt even came. Ethan looked down at the sandwich again, then back at the girl who was now sketching something intently, her legs swinging beneath the table. It couldn't be. Could it? He'd left Grace before anything was confirmed, before she ever said the word, before she ever called it a choice. And he had told himself for years that maybe she was fine, that maybe it had all been nothing, that she would have told him if what? If she had a child. His child. The thought rattled him. He looked again. The girl laughed quietly to herself as she erased something in her drawing, completely unaware that the man watching her was trying to piece together a timeline of guilt, memory, and coincidence. Ethan's hand trembled slightly as he brought the coffee to his lips, though he didn't drink. He couldn't shake the feeling that somehow impossibly this little girl had just torn open the past without even trying. For the next 7 mornings, Ethan Whitaker returned to the little bakery on the corner of Ashburn's sleepy Main Street without fail. Always arriving just after sunrise, always taking the same seat by the window. He never ordered more than black coffee, never brought a book or a laptop, never made a call. He simply sat, his presence quiet but constant, like the steam rising from his cup. Grace noticed, of course. How could she not? A stranger in Ashbourne didn't go unseen, especially not one who wore pressed shirts and leather shoes in a town that favored flannel and mud-stained boots. But Ethan didn't cause trouble. He didn't flirt or complain or speak unless spoken to. He came, nodded, paid in cash, and left $1 more than necessary in the tip jar. Still, his eyes never left the booth near the counter, the one where Lily sat each morning with her notebook open and her pencil moving. She seemed unaware of the attention, or if she noticed, she didn't mind. Children who grow up around adults who carry grief learn to give space without asking questions. Lily just drew. She drew animals in coats and flying fish and long-necked birds that lived in rain clouds. She drew Grace's hands and a robin that nested near the back window, and Ethan watched as if the scratch of her pencil somehow steadied him. There were moments he nearly said something, when Lily laughed at her own drawing or when she offered him half a cookie she'd saved, but the words never made it to his mouth. He was afraid. Afraid of being wrong. Afraid of being right. Afraid of what it would mean to ask a question whose answer might change everything. So he watched. He memorized the way she furrowed her brow when sketching, the way her shoes never quite matched the way her nose crinkled when she was proud. And each day when he left, the hollow ache inside him deepened because something about this little girl, this quiet bakery, this woman behind the counter who never quite met his eyes, felt like a life he might have had if only he'd stayed. Back then, it had all happened under autumn leaves and ivy-covered stone, when the world still felt like it could be shaped by willpower alone. Yale was the kind of place where legacy names echoed louder than conviction, and Ethan Whitaker, heir to the Whitaker law dynasty, was expected to follow a script written generations before he was born. He met Grace Holloway in a campus cafe during sophomore year, and everything unraveled after that. She wasn't part of his world. She was studying literature on scholarship, worked evenings at the library, and didn't care about formal dinners or secret societies. But she saw him. Not the name, not the future senator. Him. And for the first time in his perfectly curated life, Ethan felt like he could breathe without pretending. They kept their relationship quiet, partly for privacy, partly because Ethan knew his father wouldn't approve. Grace was kind, sharp, unshakably honest, and completely uninterested in becoming a Whittaker trophy. For 2 years, they orbited each other like gravity until the night she sat across from him on a park bench near the art building, her hands trembling slightly as she told him she was pregnant. Ethan remembered everything about that moment, the wind in the trees, the way her voice cracked when she said, "I'm not asking for anything," and the look in her eyes bracing for him to vanish. He had tried not to. He had wanted to be brave. But the weight of his last name of the path laid out for him, of his father's voice echoing in his head like a gavel, was too much. "This will ruin you," his father had said coldly when Ethan, in a rare moment of courage, confessed the truth. "You think that girl loves you? She'll love you right into mediocrity." The next day, Ethan left. No note, no explanation, just a phone call. Grace never answered, in silence ever since. He told himself she'd be fine, that it was better for her this way, that he had no choice. But now, watching Lily from across a small-town bakery table, he wondered how many lies he'd swallowed to protect a life he didn't even want. Grace had never asked him for anything. Not a promise, not money, not even an explanation. That was what haunted Ethan the most in the years that followed. After she told him she was pregnant, and after he made the coward's choice, there had been no desperate phone calls, no angry letters, no attempts to pull him back. She simply vanished quietly and completely, as if she had folded herself into the margins of a life that no longer included him. And for years, he let her stay there, tucked into the shadows of memory, where regret was easier to ignore. He sometimes searched her name in private late at night with the lights off, half hoping, half dreading that she had left a digital trace. But there was nothing. No wedding announcements, no obituaries, no social media to stalk or clues to follow. It was as if she had stepped off the map the moment he stepped away, and maybe that was her way of surviving. Grace was always like that, fiercely independent, quietly defiant. When they were together at Yale, she would roll her eyes at the girls who pouted for attention or the boys who begged for validation. "Need makes you fragile," she once told him, her voice calm but certain. "I don't like needing anyone." At the time, he had found it admirable. Now he saw it for what it was, armor. She hadn't begged him to stay because she'd already learned what it cost to rely on someone who could walk away. And Ethan had proved her right. So when she disappeared, she wasn't being cruel. She was protecting what little dignity she had left. It was her silence that cut deepest. Not because it was filled with anger, but because it wasn't. It was clean. Final. The kind of silence that didn't leave room for redemption. And now, sitting in that bakery day after day, watching a little girl who looked so much like her, Ethan realized he had never been forgotten. He had been erased with intention, with clarity, and with strength. Grace had rebuilt a life without him, and done it so thoroughly that she hadn't even left a door cracked open. And yet, here he was, trying to find a way back into a story he'd abandoned before the first chapter even finished. By the 8th morning, something in Ethan shifted. The silent watching wasn't enough anymore. He couldn't keep drinking lukewarm coffee and pretending that the ache in his chest was just nostalgia. He needed to know. He needed to hear it, not from his imagination, not from guilt, but from something tangible. So he started asking questions, not directly, not to Grace. He wasn't ready for that confrontation, not yet. Instead, he turned to the rhythm of small-town curiosity. He chatted with Edna, the elderly woman who came in every morning for lemon scones and gossip, and with Luis, the part-time cook who whistled off-key while frying bacon. Casually, carefully, Ethan asked, "That little girl, Lily, is she Grace's?" The answers were always simple. "Oh yeah," her daughter Edna said without looking up from her crossword. "Smart one, always drawing." Another patron added, "Been bringing her in since she was a toddler. Quiet like her mom." Ethan's breath would catch each time. Quiet, smart, always drawing. It was like watching the pieces of a puzzle snap together one by one, and each one left him a little more breathless. He learned that Lily's last name was Holloway, that she had no father listed on school records, that she sometimes hummed songs under her breath that sounded eerily familiar, fragments of lullabies Grace once sang in their dorm room curled under cheap blankets with borrowed speakers. The more he listened, the more he saw it, the curve of her cheek, the defiant lift of her chin when she disagreed with something, the quiet way she observed the world before speaking. They weren't just similarities. They were echoes. DNA worn into posture and rhythm and instinct, and it terrified him. Because if Lily was truly his then, that meant he had a daughter who had grown up without him, who had laughed, cried, drawn entire worlds in silence, and he hadn't seen any of it. The possibility crawled under his skin into his chest until he couldn't sit still anymore. He needed the truth. But truth meant facing Grace. And that meant facing the man he had once been, the man who left. The man he now hated more than anyone. It was late afternoon when Ethan finally gathered the courage to stay past breakfast. The bakery had emptied out the morning crowd, replaced by quiet. The scent of cinnamon and coffee lingering in the air like a memory that refused to fade. Lily had gone home early with a neighbor after complaining of a sore throat, and for the first time all week, Ethan found himself alone with Grace. She was wiping down the counter, her back to him, the sleeves of her worn flannel shirt rolled up to her elbows, arms moving with mechanical precision. He stood, slowly walked over and cleared his throat, not loudly, just enough to be heard. She didn't turn. "Need a refill?" she asked flatly. "No," he said. "I need the truth." Her hand stilled just for a second. Then she continued, wiping slower now, as if bracing for something inevitable. Ethan's voice softened. "Grace, is Lily mine?" There it was out in the open, fragile and heavy like glass suspended over concrete. For a long moment she said nothing. The silence stretched so tight it felt like it might snap. Then she set down the cloth, turned, and met his eyes. Her face was calm, but tired, the kind of tired that lives beneath the skin deeper than sleep can reach. "Yes," she said simply. "She is." Ethan's breath left him in a rush, not dramatic but real. Something inside him deflated, collapsed under the weight of confirmation. He nodded once slowly, as if the motion could anchor him. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked the question, almost a whisper. Grace didn't flinch. "Because you left. You made your choice. And I had to make mine." Her words weren't bitter, just honest, steady. "I didn't want Lily to grow up feeling like someone might come or go depending on what was convenient. So I built something stable. Without you." Ethan swallowed hard. There was no anger in her voice, no accusations. Somehow that made it worse. "I would have come back," he said quietly. "If I'd known." She looked at him with eyes that had seen too many mornings alone, too many nights worrying about money and colds and forgotten birthdays. "But you didn't ask," she said, and he had no answer for that. Grace stood there, hands steady on the edge of the counter, as Ethan tried to find something, anything to say that would matter. But before he could speak again, she raised her hand gently, not in anger, but in quiet finality. "Don't," she said, her voice low but clear. "Don't say you're sorry. Don't say you'll fix it. I'm not asking for that." Ethan's brows drew together, his heart caught somewhere between hope and guilt. "But I should have." She cut him off with a soft shake of her head. "Ethan, I didn't call you here. You came, on your own. And I need you to understand something." She paused, breathing in like she'd rehearsed these words before, maybe 1,000 times in the quiet hours of early morning or late-night feedings when the loneliness pressed in close. "I'm not angry anymore. I was once. But I've let that go." Her gaze held his, then steady and unflinching. What I can't let go of is this. I can't have someone step into Lily's life, only to walk out again when it gets inconvenient or heavy or real. I won't do that to her. Her voice didn't rise, didn't tremble, but it landed like stone. I've spent 8 years making sure she never had to wonder if she was worth staying for. I've sacrificed sleep pride, and more than you could guess, to build something solid. I don't need you to tear that down with good intentions. Ethan opened his mouth, closed it again. He felt stripped down, laid bare by a truth he hadn't expected, not because it was cruel, but because it was right. "So what do you want from me?" he asked finally, almost desperate. "Nothing," Grace replied. "I didn't want anything then, and I don't want anything now. Not money, not apologies, not promises you might not keep." She stepped back slightly, her eyes softening but never wavering. "I don't need a man who arrives too late trying to rewrite history. I need peace for my daughter. And I need to know that if you're here, it's not just to feel better. It's because you're ready to stay. Otherwise, please leave quietly." And for the first time in his life, Ethan Whitaker had no defense. That evening, Ethan returned to his penthouse overlooking the city skyline, a sleek expanse of polished marble glass and silence. The elevator opened directly into the living room, lights triggered automatically by motion, casting a warm glow on curated furniture and art no one ever truly looked at. The air was too still, the walls too pristine, like a hotel suite no one had dared to live in. He dropped his keys onto the counter, the soft clatter echoing louder than it should in a place so large and so empty. For years, this space had been a symbol of success, of arrival. Every inch was meticulously designed, custom-built, a testament to power and control. And yet, as he stood there now, jacket still on, shoes untouched by dirt, it felt hollow, lifeless. Not lonely, worse than that. Meaningless. He walked through the rooms like a ghost, touching nothing, pausing by the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the glittering skyline. Somewhere out there were people living, laughing, struggling, waking up beside someone who whispered, "Good morning," who mattered. And here he was, 36 years old, partner at one of the most powerful firms in the country, name etched into marble and mahogany, and utterly alone. No family photos, no fridge magnets, no scattered toys or half-finished drawings taped to the wall. Just silence, wealth, and an aching awareness that none of it was enough. He poured himself a drink, barely tasted it. The image of Lily kept flashing through his mind, the way she offered half a sandwich to a stranger, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the way she had no idea that the man sitting across the bakery from her every morning was her father. Or maybe she did. Children sometimes knew things their parents didn't tell them. Maybe she saw it in his face. Maybe that's why Grace was so careful. Because this cold, polished solitude was the life he had chosen over them. And for the first time, standing in the center of everything he had built, Ethan realized he had nothing. Nothing that could hold him when he woke in the night. Nothing that would draw a picture of him with a crooked smile and tape it proudly to the wall. Nothing that mattered. From the next morning on, something began to shift gently, almost imperceptibly at first, like the slow bend of light before sunrise. Ethan showed up at the bakery before the bell even rang, standing awkwardly in front of the counter as Grace flipped the sign to open. He didn't say much, just gave her a quiet nod, eyes lingering not on her, but on the little girl twirling a crayon between her fingers at the corner booth. Lily looked up and blinked, surprised but not afraid. By the time Grace handed her a toasted bagel and reminded her it was a school day, Ethan had already stepped forward. "I'll drive her," he said, his voice calm, unassuming. Grace hesitated. The pause stretched longer than a second, shorter than regret. Then she gave a small nod, not permission, but acceptance of a possibility she wasn't ready to name. Lily slipped her tiny backpack on, glanced at her mother, then at Ethan, and smiled, cautious, curious, but open. That first drive was quiet. Ethan didn't push. He asked if she liked school. She shrugged. He pointed out a squirrel darting across the road. She giggled. By the time they pulled up to the modest brick elementary school, she looked at him and said, "You drive slower than Mrs. Parker." He smiled genuinely. The next day he came again, and the day after. Soon, it wasn't just morning drop-offs. It was after-school pickups, occasional grocery runs, trips to the park on Sunday afternoons. Grace never officially agreed, but she never told him to stop either. Some days, she walked beside them, arms folded but soft-eyed. Other days, she stayed behind and watched from the window. They were not a family, not yet, but something was unfolding, something tentative and strangely steady. Lily began leaving her drawings on Ethan's dashboard, wobbly sketches of trees, hearts, 3 stick figures holding hands. One day she wrote us underneath. Ethan didn't say anything, just stared at the paper for a long time. In the quiet moments between drop-offs and meals and errands, a rhythm emerged, not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. And sometimes the most miraculous thing isn't a grand gesture. It's a man learning how to braid a little girl's hair with clumsy fingers, or a mother watching without flinching as the man she once loved tries day by day to stay. The news of Ethan Whitaker's reappearance traveled faster than wildfire through the quiet town of Ashbourne, but it didn't hit with real consequence until it reached the Caldwell residence, a weathered farmhouse on the outskirts of town where the front porch creaked with history and judgment lingered like a second skin. Harold and Margaret Caldwell had spent the better part of a decade burying the memory of Ethan, not because it was painful, but because it was infuriating. To them, he was not a tragic love story or a misunderstood young man. He was the coward who left their daughter alone, pregnant and humiliated, while he disappeared into the ease of legacy and wealth. They had held Grace through contractions in a cramped hospital room without a single Whitaker in sight, wiped her tears as she balanced night shifts and diapers, and helped raise Lily with the kind of protective fierceness that only wounded pride can breed. So when Margaret heard from a neighbor that Ethan Whitaker's been dropping that little girl off at school all week, she didn't wait for confirmation. She walked straight into the kitchen, placed the flour sifter down with more force than necessary, and called Harold in from the barn. "He's back," she said flatly. Harold didn't need a name. He wiped his hands on an oil-stained rag and stared at her for a long, tense moment. Then he asked. Grace knows Margaret nodded. Knows and hasn't said a damn word. That silence, more than the news itself, stung them, because it meant Grace had opened a door without them. Let a man back into her life and into Lily's without the protective barrier they had built around her for years. That night they drove to town, uninvited but not unannounced. Grace opened the door and didn't look surprised. She only stepped aside and said, "I figured you'd come." Inside, the conversation wasn't loud, but it burned. Margaret's voice was sharp, but contained Harold's low and firm. "We didn't suffer through 8 years helping you build something steady just so he could come in and rewrite the ending," Margaret said. "What if he leaves again? What if Lily gets used to having him around, starts loving him, and then he walks away like before Grace met their eyes, calm, but unshaken? Then he'll have to answer to her, not just to me." Her voice didn't waver. "But if he's trying now, really trying, not out of guilt, but because he wants to stay, then I have to let him. For her." Harold exhaled slowly, his weathered hands clenched and unclenched. "You sure this isn't about you still loving him?" Grace looked down at her hands, then back up. "I'm not sure of anything yet, except that Lily deserves the truth, and a chance, even if it scares all of us." The tension between Grace and her parents had never fully healed, not even after Lily was born, not even after they'd helped raise her. The truth was, the Caldwells had never truly forgiven Grace for becoming a mother on her own terms, and they had certainly never forgiven Ethan Whitaker for disappearing when she needed him most. But what lay unspoken beneath all the anger and protection was a deeper wound, one the Caldwells rarely acknowledged: their own shame. Harold and Margaret Caldwell were proud people, working-class, church-going, and deeply concerned with appearances in a town where everyone knew everyone else's business. When Grace came home from college pregnant with no ring, no explanation, and no father in sight, their world cracked. Margaret had cried not out of heartbreak, but humiliation. Harold had paced for hours, refusing to speak, while the town whispered behind curtains and over casseroles. For weeks they tried to make her see reason, suggesting homes for unwed mothers, long bus rides to distant clinics, even adoption. Grace had refused all of it. She said the child was hers and she would raise it whether they helped or not. For a time, they didn't. They closed their doors and their hearts told the neighbors they didn't know the whole story and let Grace scrape by waitressing, living in the back of an old trailer with a leaky roof and second-hand crib. It wasn't until Lily was born, small, pink, and fiercely alive, that something softened. Margaret had come by one rainy evening claiming she brought soup, but really just wanting to see the baby. Harold followed a few days later, pretending to fix the door, but spending most of the visit holding Lily with a look he thought no one noticed. Slowly, without apology, they re-entered Grace's life. But the judgment never fully left. Every school event, every new job, every scraped knee or missed bill was weighed against that original sin. Their daughter had chosen to raise a child alone, and in their eyes, she had defied everything they'd taught her about how life should go. And now, with Ethan back, their old fears reignited. Not just because they didn't trust him, but because deep down his return threatened the story they had built around themselves, that they were the ones who saved Grace when he failed her. If Ethan stayed and did right by them now, it meant they had been wrong about him, and maybe even about her. It meant the tidy narrative they'd clung to for years was far messier than they ever wanted to admit. And pride for the Caldwells was a stubborn inheritance. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of quiet, overcast day that felt ordinary until it wasn't. Grace was finishing up a double shift at the bakery when her phone buzzed. 2 missed calls from Lily's school, then a voicemail from the principal. Her heart clenched, panic rising before she could even press play. "Ms. Caldwell," the voice said, calm but cautious. "Your parents, Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, came to pick Lily up today. They insisted they were listed as emergency contacts and said there was a family matter. I wanted to let you know." Grace didn't hear the rest. She was already out the door, apron still tied around her waist, running down Main Street like the past was chasing her. When she arrived at the farmhouse, the same one she once ran from with a newborn in her arms, Lily was sitting on the porch, coloring quietly. Margaret brought out a glass of milk like nothing was wrong. Harold stood beside her, arms crossed, jaw set. "What the hell are you doing?" Grace demanded, chest-heaving, eyes wild. "We're her grandparents," Margaret replied. Tone clipped. "We've got rights." "Rights," Grace repeated, incredulous. "You shut me out when I needed you. You didn't even want Lily to be born." Harold stepped forward. "We were wrong, all right. But we're trying to fix it now. We talked to a lawyer." That stopped Grace cold. "A lawyer? You're working 2 jobs." "Grace," Margaret said, softer now, but with steel underneath. "You're exhausted." She's bouncing between school, the bakery, and whatever time Ethan can give her. That's no life for a child. You don't get to come back after 8 years and decide you know what she needs. "We never stopped caring," Harold said. "But we should have done more. We see that now. We want to raise her. Properly. In a stable home." "You think this is about a stable home?" Grace's voice cracked. "This is about control, about pride, about rewriting the past so you don't feel guilty anymore." Margaret looked away. "We just want what's best." "No," Grace snapped. "You want what makes you feel better." The wind picked up, brushing Lily's curls as she looked up from her drawing, sensing the storm in her mother's voice. Grace swallowed hard and knelt beside her daughter, taking her hand. "You're not taking her," she said, voice quiet but unshakable. "Not with lawyers, not with guilt, not ever." But in the days that followed, a letter arrived, formal cold, signed by a judge. The Caldwells weren't backing down. They were filing for custody. And the past Grace thought she'd survived was suddenly demanding to be relived, one painful battle at a time. Lily didn't have the words for what she was feeling, only the weight of it. It pressed against her chest in the early mornings when she woke up in the small bedroom above the bakery, eyes darting toward the door as if something might change overnight. It showed up in her drawings too, once full of trees and animals and crooked little houses with hearts above them, now filled with divided shapes, people standing on opposite cliffs. A little girl with a question mark over her head. Grace noticed it first when Lily forgot her lunch 2 days in a row, something she never did. Then came the nightmares. Soft whimpers in the middle of the night that grew into cries loud enough to shake Grace from her half-sleep. Each time she rushed in, Lily was already sitting up, clutching the frayed corner of her blanket, her face pale and damp. Was it the one with the suitcase again? Grace asked gently after the third night. Lily nodded, silent. She couldn't describe the dream, not really, but the feeling was always the same. She was being taken away, sometimes by strangers in uniforms, sometimes by her grandparents, and in the worst ones by Ethan himself. He would smile in the dream, but his eyes were sad, and he always said the same thing. It's better this way. When she told Ethan about the dream, her voice trembled. He sat beside her on the park bench where they'd gone after school and didn't say a word for a long time. Then he reached for her drawing pad and gently slid it into his lap. "What would you draw if the dream ended differently?" he asked. Lily stared at him. "I don't know. I don't want the dream to end. I want it to never start." Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly aware of just how much he had missed, how many birthdays, tears, questions, fears. Grace joined them a few minutes later, her face calm but tired. She could see it too, the unraveling, the small cracks in Lily's otherwise brave little heart. "She's afraid of losing everything," Grace said later that night when Ethan walked her to her door, "of being passed around like something no one can keep." Ethan looked down. "She's not wrong to be scared." "No," Grace replied. "She's just too young to understand that love doesn't always get to make the rules. Courts do. And with a custody battle looming, that fear, quiet, constant, and cruel, became Lily's unwelcome shadow." Grace stood by the sink in the dim light of the bakery's back kitchen, her hands submerged in soapy water, scrubbing a tray that had long since been clean. The motion wasn't about cleanliness. It was about control, about giving her shaking hands something to do while the weight of her decision pressed against her ribs. The custody hearing was in a week. Her parents had already hired a lawyer from Lexington, someone sharp and expensive. She knew the court would look at the hours she worked, the paycheck-to-paycheck reality she lived in, and compare it to the Caldwells' farmhouse, their pensions, their promises of stability and tradition. Most of all, she feared what it would do to Lily to see her mother dragged through questions and paperwork, to witness the adults she trusted divide themselves like war camps. So she'd made a decision, one that felt like both betrayal and mercy. She would withdraw from the fight. Let her parents win on paper. She would still be around. She'd still see Lily, but not as her sole guardian. Not with the title of mother in the legal sense. She was halfway through composing the email to her lawyer when Ethan appeared unannounced as usual, though somehow his presence always seemed to arrive with the wind, quiet, inevitable. He stood in the doorway watching her. "You're giving up," he said. Not a question. Grace didn't turn around. "I'm doing what's best for her. You think Lily wants to wake up in a house without you?" Ethan's voice was calm, but shaking beneath. "You think that's what she needs?" Grace finally looked up, her eyes red but dry. "What she needs is peace, and she won't have that if this goes to court. She won't survive watching us all tear each other apart just to claim a piece of her." Ethan stepped into the room slowly, like approaching something fragile. "She doesn't need perfect. She needs real. She needs the mother who raised her on nothing but strength and cinnamon rolls and stories whispered between double shifts." "You don't understand, Ethan," she said quietly. they'll win. You and I were chaos compared to them. On paper, they look like saints. Then screw the paper, he said, his voice finally breaking. We show the court the truth. We show them the little girl who still draws her mom holding her hand, who still wakes up in the night and whispers your name first. You don't walk away because you're scared to lose. You stay because she's worth fighting for, and because she's watching. Grace closed her eyes. She wanted to believe it, wanted to believe love could stand up in court, that presence and persistence meant something in legal terms. But in that moment, hearing the desperation in Ethan's voice, the conviction, she realized something had shifted. He wasn't trying to fix the past. He was standing in the present with her. Finally. And maybe that was enough to try one more time. The night was quiet, the kind of hush that blanketed even the sound of passing cars beyond the window. Lily sat cross-legged on the worn couch, a half-eaten peanut butter sandwich on her plate, crayon smudges on her fingers and cheek. Ethan sat beside her, unusually still, hands folded in his lap, as if anchoring himself. Grace had stepped out to run an errand, leaving them alone for the first time in days. The TV murmured in the background, forgotten. Lily glanced at him, sensing something weighted in the air, something more than silence. Want to draw? She offered, nudging her sketchbook toward him. Ethan smiled softly. Not tonight. I was thinking maybe I could tell you a story instead. Lily's eyes widened slightly, curious, cautious. She nodded and curled a little closer. Ethan took a breath, then another, like pulling courage from places he hadn't touched in years. Once he began, there was a man who had everything people think matters. Big job, tall buildings, lots of people listening when he talked. But there was one thing he didn't have, and that was peace. Lily blinked up at him, quiet. He continued. He met someone a long time ago. Someone kind, someone who made the world feel quieter in the best way. She smiled like spring. And just when life was starting to change, when something really important was growing, he got scared. Not of her, not even of being a father. He got scared of what his world would say, of disappointing the people who'd built that world for him. His voice thin, tight in the throat. So he left. He told himself it was the right thing, that she'd be better off without him. But that wasn't true. And deep down, he knew it. Lily didn't say a word. She held a crayon between her fingers like it might snap. Ethan went on slower now. Years passed. The man got richer, more powerful. But every room felt empty no matter how full it looked. He told stories to strangers and smiled in photographs, but he couldn't tell himself the truth. His voice broke slightly, that he'd walked away from the only thing that could have made him whole. A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Ethan turned to her, his eyes soft but steady. Then one day, he met a little girl in a bakery. She offered him half a sandwich and a piece of her heart without even knowing who he was. And in that moment, the man realized he didn't want to run anymore. He didn't want to be the person who left. Lily stared at him, her breath held. Was the little girl mad at him? She asked finally. Ethan shook his head slowly. I think she was confused and a little scared. But mostly I think she just wanted to know he'd stay this time. He reached for her hand, not forcing, just offering. Lily hesitated, then slowly placed her small fingers in his. I don't like stories where people leave, she whispered. Me neither, he said. That's why I'm writing a different ending now. The summons arrived in a manila envelope stamped with the seal of the county court, a thick stack of legal documents that smelled of ink and finality. Grace held it in her hands as if it might burn her, her eyes scanning the lines of cold legal phrasing that declared without emotion the Caldwell family's formal petition for full custody of Lily Whitaker. It wasn't a surprise, not really. But the reality of it, the brutal certainty of courtrooms and judges and testimonies, still struck like a blow to the chest. The Caldwells weren't simply showing up to plead their case. They were coming in full force. Their lawyer was a family rights specialist from Louisville, sharp-suited and silver-tongued with a reputation for winning high-profile disputes. The documents outlined the assets the Caldwells would place in trust for Lily, the deed to their family farm, a $50,000 education savings plan, and a notarized commitment to fund her through any college she wished to attend. The case was presented not as a condemnation of Grace, but as a concerned correction, a gentle but firm redirection of Lily's future toward stability, legacy, and structured opportunity. They even had letters of support from former teachers, pastors, and family friends, all praising the Caldwells' values, their community involvement, their readiness to raise a child with proper guidance. Grace sat at the kitchen table, the letter trembling slightly in her grip, while Ethan read over her shoulder. Neither of them spoke for a long time, because it was clear this wasn't just a legal move. It was a declaration of war dressed in Sunday best. A battle fought with polished smiles, scholarship funds, and the unspoken accusation that love, when unaccompanied by wealth or pedigree, might not be enough. And somewhere in the middle of it all was Lily, 8 years old, unaware of the power struggle being waged in her name. The courtroom was silent for a moment too long after the question landed. Ethan Whitaker sat at the polished wooden witness stand, his tailored suit unable to disguise the tension in his shoulders or the storm beneath his calm expression. The Caldwell attorney, a composed woman with a steel gaze and measured voice, repeated it, her tone sharper now. Laced with judgment no amount of civility could mask. "Mr. Whitaker, where were you the past 9 years of this child's life?" Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of the table, and for a brief moment, the perfectly controlled mask he had worn for most of his adult life cracked. He inhaled, slow and deliberate. "I was at Yale when Grace told me she was pregnant." He began, voice steady but edged with something heavier than nerves regret. "At the time, I was 21, the son of a powerful family. Everything in my life had been decided for me: college, career, future spouse, everything. My parents made it clear if I stayed with Grace, I would lose everything. They told me the baby couldn't be mine, that it would ruin our name. And I listened." His voice dipped softer now, but unwavering. "I left. I buried the truth so deep that I almost believed it myself. And then I spent the next 9 years building towers and earning accolades, until none of it mattered." The lawyer leaned in slightly, folding her arms. "And during those years, did you ever reach out? Try to find them?" Ethan met her gaze, guilt raw in his eyes. "No, I didn't. And that's something I will carry for the rest of my life." The judge said nothing. Neither did Grace, sitting a few rows behind Lily's small hand clutched in hers. The silence stretched again, not empty, but thick with consequence. Because Ethan knew this was the question that mattered most. Not what he was doing now, but what he had failed to do then. Grace sat motionless on the cold bench of the courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap, fingers interlocked not out of prayer, but to keep from trembling. She said nothing, not when Ethan confessed to 9 years of silence, not when the Caldwells' attorney painted their lives in watercolor perfection, porches, pensions, and piano lessons already planned, not when Lily's name was spoken like a possession to be claimed. Her silence wasn't anger, and it wasn't surrender. It was something quieter, something heavier, grief without noise. She had prepared herself for this moment, told herself again and again that she wouldn't lash out, wouldn't defend or accuse, wouldn't unravel in front of strangers deciding her daughter's fate. So, she simply sat. And in doing so, she became unreadable to everyone in the room, including Ethan. He glanced back at her only once during his testimony, hoping for something, a nod, a flicker of recognition, even disappointment. But Grace's face remained still, her eyes locked on the judge, her mouth pressed shut. Because what could she say? That he had hurt her? Everyone already knew. That he had changed. Maybe. But change didn't erase absence. And love, real love, wasn't always enough to fix what time and silence had broken. The Caldwells sat on the opposite side of the aisle upright and composed hands resting calmly on folded briefs. Their lawyer was confident. Grace could tell. They had money, legacy, stability. They could offer Lily horseback riding in the summer's dance lessons in the fall. They were predictable, safe. Ethan, on the other hand, offered something messier, newfound devotion, and broken pieces trying to reassemble into something whole. No one in the room knew which version the court would choose. No one could say who would walk out with legal custody. The air buzzed with uncertainty. But Grace, despite her silence, knew one thing with aching clarity. Whoever won Lily would still be watching, and that meant everything said or unsaid in that courtroom would live inside her forever. The courtroom hushed as the judge leaned forward, his voice gentle, but weighted with solemn authority. "Lily," he said, looking down at the small figure seated beside the child advocate, "you've heard a lot of grown-up things today, and I know that can be confusing. But I'd like to ask you a very important question now, and you can answer however you feel is right. Who would you like to live with?" For a moment, silence stretched so thin it could snap. 8-year-old Lily swung her legs slightly under the chair, her fingers tracing nervous circles on her dress. Her eyes flicked across the room from her grandparents in crisp, expectant posture, to Ethan sitting still as stone, trying not to show the ache behind his steady gaze, and finally to Grace, whose face was unreadable, soft but still. Grace didn't move, didn't plead. She met her daughter's eyes without expectation, without urging, offering nothing but calm presence. She had promised herself she would never make Lily choose, and now here they were. Lily blinked, swallowed, then whispered something to the advocate, who repeated it aloud. She says she wants to stay where her heart feels safe. There was a ripple in the room, not a gasp, not a cheer, but a shift like the air realigning itself. The judge nodded slowly. No names had been spoken. No one had been declared victor. But in that one sentence, a child had quietly altered the gravity of the case. Grace exhaled shakily, the closest thing to a crack in her composure. Ethan lowered his head for a moment, as if in silent prayer. The Caldwells looked stunned, gracefully so, but stunned nonetheless. No one knew what the final ruling would be. The law weighed documents, incomes, structures. But sometimes the truth belonged to the smallest voice in the room. The room was still spinning with legal jargon and heavy silence when Lily slowly reached into the small front pocket of her cardigan and pulled out something crumpled but carefully folded, a handmade paper bracelet, the kind a child would craft during a quiet afternoon, with uneven letters drawn in marker and tiny hearts dotting the edges. She unfolded it with quiet reverence, smoothing it out on her lap, and then held it up for the judge to see. The words, written in shaky but determined handwriting, read, "My daddy." Every breath in the courtroom paused. The child advocate leaned closer, unsure what Lily meant to say, but Lily didn't wait for help this time. Her voice, though soft, carried the weight of something deeper than any adult testimony that had come before. "I want to live with the person who stayed when I had a fever of 102 for 3 days, she said, turning her head slightly, then lifting her arm and pointing directly at Ethan. "He held the bowl when I couldn't keep food down. He sat in the hallway so I could sleep with the light on. He brought me lemon water and whispered stories when I was scared." Her voice trembled slightly, but she stood by it, her small hand steady in the air. "He didn't leave." Ethan's breath caught audibly in his chest, eyes stinging as every moment of those sleepless nights came rushing back. The fear, the helplessness, the quiet determination to prove that presence mattered more than perfection. The judge blinked slowly, visibly moved. Even the Caldwell attorney faltered, her stack of rebuttals losing shape in her hands. Grace, still sitting in the back row, lowered her head as her eyes welled with tears, not because she had lost, but because her daughter had spoken her truth with absolute clarity. The paper bracelet remained in Lily's lap, a fragile but irrefutable symbol of the love that had been shown, not in promises but in presence. That evening, after the courtroom had emptied and the sun had slipped behind the low rooftops of Ashburn, Grace, Ethan, and Lily walked home together in a silence that wasn't awkward but reverent, like a pause after something sacred. They didn't speak much on the way back, not because there wasn't anything to say, but because everything had already been said in the courtroom in a child's voice and a paper bracelet. Grace held Lily's hand. Ethan walked beside them, his steps just slightly behind, as if still unsure if he was allowed to be part of this picture. When they reached the corner bakery, Grace hesitated at the door. She glanced at Ethan, not asking permission, not extending an invitation, but simply looking. And that look said enough. He followed. Inside the bakery felt smaller than usual shadows stretching across the booths, the counters quiet and unlit. But to Lily, it was still home. She dropped her backpack in her usual spot and began sketching again like nothing had happened, as if courtrooms and custody hearings were just another errand to cross off a list. Grace went to the kitchen to brew tea, and Ethan sat at the same booth where it all began, watching his daughter draw. "You're good at that," he said, voice soft. "My teacher says I should enter the county art contest," Lily replied without looking up. Then she added, "Will you come if I do?" Ethan's throat tightened. "Yes," he said. "I'll be there." Grace returned with 3 mismatched mugs and sat down across from them. The room was quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore. For the first time in 9 years, there was space for 3. And as the tea steeped and Lily's pencils scratched across paper, Ethan realized something profound. Being named a guardian wasn't a finish line. It was a beginning. He wasn't here to erase the past or to claim a title. He was here to stay, to build trust brick by brick, moment by moment, to prove that love isn't something you declare. It's something you show up for again and again. The morning after the custody hearing, the Caldwell house stood still and silent, its shutters drawn and the garden beds left untouched for the first time in weeks. No more attorneys pulled into the driveway, no more whispered strategy calls floated through the walls, and no more tense dinners filled the dining room with unspoken disappointment. They had lost, not in the legal sense alone, but in something deeper. Margaret Caldwell, once so fierce in her convictions, sat at her writing desk long after dawn, her tea untouched her hands, hovering over a piece of stationery she had saved for church letters and thank-you notes. But this wasn't gratitude. It was regret. Her pen moved slowly, uncertainly, tracing out the apology that had taken 9 years too long. "Grace," she began, "I was wrong. Not just recently, but years ago. I judged you not because you failed, but because I was too proud to understand your kind of strength. You raised Lily with dignity when we turned our backs. That's something I can never repay. I didn't fight for her out of love. I fought out of guilt. And guilt is a poor foundation for motherhood. I see now that being her grandmother does not entitle me to her trust. It must be earned, and I didn't earn it. I hope one day if she asks about us, you will tell her we tried to make it right, even if we failed." She signed it simply Margaret and folded the paper with care, placing it inside an envelope with no return address. Later that afternoon, while the bakery was closed for restocking, Grace found the note slipped under the front door. There was no knock, no fanfare, just a quiet act of contrition left like a gift no one asked for. She read it in silence, then folded it back up and tucked it into her apron pocket. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. But something in her chest shifted like a long-locked window finally cracking open. Forgiveness, she knew, wasn't a lightning strike. It was a slow, hard thaw. And maybe, just maybe, it had begun. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind of quiet day in Ashbourne when the clouds hang low and the air smells like fresh bread and wood smoke. Grace had just finished setting out trays of cinnamon rolls when Ethan walked in, not in his usual pressed suit or city polish, but in jeans and a flannel shirt that somehow made him look more like the man she once knew, the boy who used to sketch poems on napkins and read Neruda beneath oak trees. He wasn't holding flowers or a velvet box, and that was the first sign something was different. Instead, he was holding an old wooden chest, weathered, dusty, and unmistakable. Grace froze. Her breath caught before her body did. She knew that box. It had belonged to her mother. Inside it was the dress, ivory satin, hand-sewn lace sleeves, and a yellowing hem that had once brushed the altar steps of a small church in Georgia. No one had opened that chest since the day her parents told her she'd brought shame to their name. She hadn't looked at it in years. Ethan placed it gently on the bakery counter and stepped back, not saying a word at first. He let her walk to it slowly, cautiously, like it might disappear. She knelt, lifted the lid, and there it was, still folded, still waiting. "I asked Margaret for it," Ethan said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "She said your mother never had the heart to throw it away." Grace didn't speak. Her fingers trembled as they touched the fabric, and her eyes welled not with surprise but recognition, the kind that only comes when something sacred returns. "I don't have a ring," Ethan continued, "because I didn't come to promise you a perfect future. I came to ask if you'd let me build something real with what we already have. I want to be there for the mornings. Lily forgets her lunch for the nights you're too tired to bake another pie, for the slow days, the hard ones, the quiet ones. Will you marry me? Not because we have to, but because we choose to. Every day." Grace looked up at him, the dress clutched to her chest, and for the first time in years, her heart said yes before her lips ever moved. The backyard smelled like wildflowers and cinnamon that morning, a scent that wrapped around the folding chairs and mismatched vases like a quiet blessing. Grace had swept the patio herself before sunrise, arranging mason jars of daisies and faded peonies beside a table draped in her grandmother's quilt. There were no violinists, no designer gowns, no camera crews capturing every angle. Only a small crowd of townsfolk, a few close friends from the bakery, and Lily, in a pale yellow dress 2 inches too long, holding a bouquet almost her size. She took her role as flower girl and bridesmaid very seriously, placing each petal with care, her face scrunched in concentration. Ethan stood near the arbor they had built the night before, just driftwood ivy and string lights, wearing a white shirt with sleeves rolled up and a boutonniere Lily had pinned on crooked. He had never looked less like a CEO and never more like himself. As Grace stepped through the back door, the entire yard seemed to inhale. Her mother's dress, carefully restored by the town seamstress, floated gently around her legs, as if it had always been waiting for this moment. She didn't carry a bouquet. She didn't need to. The way Ethan looked at her, like time had stopped and started all at once, was more than enough. The officiant cleared his throat softly, but before he could begin, Ethan bent down on one knee, not to propose again, but to whisper to Lily, who stood by his side clutching her bouquet with white knuckles. "Hey," he murmured, his voice catching just slightly. "I need you to hear something, okay?" Lily blinked up at him, curious. Ethan leaned closer, one hand brushing her shoulder. "I'm here now," he said, barely more than a whisper. "And I'm not going anywhere. Not ever again." Lily didn't respond with words. She just nodded once solemnly and slid her tiny hand into his. And then, with the late morning sun warming the grass and the wind rustling the ivy above their heads, they said their vows not just as a couple, but as a family, 3 hearts stitched together, not by law or blood, but by the simple sacred act of staying. In the end, what this story reminds us is that love, real transformative love, isn't proven in grand gestures or perfect timing, but in the quiet, relentless act of showing up. Ethan didn't rewrite the past. He simply chose to be present in the now, and that's a truth many of us forget. Life gets messy, people make mistakes, families fall apart, and sometimes reassemble in the most unexpected ways. But the healing begins when someone stops running, when they stay through awkward silences, fevers, early morning routines, and late-night doubts. Grace didn't need a savior. She needed a partner. Lily didn't need a millionaire. She needed her dad at the dinner table. And sometimes forgiveness isn't a dramatic reunion, it's a slow building of trust day by day, moment by moment. So if you're watching this and there's someone you've drifted from, someone you've let go of because you thought it was too late, ask yourself if maybe there's still time to show up. Maybe not with a perfect plan, but with a willing heart. That one step might change everything. And if you're someone who's been hurt or abandoned, remember your worth was never measured by who walked away, but by how you kept going. Grace and Lily didn't wait for rescue, they built a life quietly with dignity, and that life became something someone else wanted to return to. The story isn't perfect, but neither is real life. What matters is presence, honesty, and the courage to begin again. What part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it Lily's quiet strength, Grace's resilience, or Ethan's transformation? Let us know in the comments. Save this video if you ever need a reminder that it's never too late to come home. And don't forget to like, follow, and subscribe for more powerful, real heart-driven stories that just might change how you see the world.